for our Bible study. Today we are looking at Luke chapter 14, and the title of our lesson this week is called The Guest List. Let's introduce our two amazing guests. If you want to know a lot of amazing information, these are the two gentlemen that you should talk with. So go ahead. How about Rick? You go first.
Yeah, hello, my name's Rick Loudermilk. Been on here a couple of times now, so you've probably seen me if you're a regular watcher. Here in First Baptist Church in Williamsburg, glad to be a part of this.
My name is George Ramey. I'm a retired professor, and you're talking about answers and questions. I told my students in class, I have an answer for any question, but half of the questions, the answer is, I don't know.
I can totally relate to that. Yes, often. Before we started this morning, I mentioned to the guys that I'm always waiting whenever we have these studies. I'm waiting for the one answer. Somebody is just going to have the answer we're all looking for. So
we're still looking.
Yep, and that's why we're here today, right?
That's right. That's right.
Absolutely. And so the story, I'm just going to pick up the beginning of chapter 14. The Bible tells us that Jesus has been invited to a dinner, to be a dinner guest at the home of a Pharisee. It says a prominent Pharisee too. So somebody this guy's a big deal. And this dinner happens to be on the Sabbath. So Jesus attends, he's a dinner guest, and we can imagine that while he's there, this guy's hosting this dinner, probably has a bunch of his important Pharisee friends, his very educated friends. They've invited Jesus, and knowing what we know about this time, that he's being watched very carefully. I'm sure these guys are observing everything he does and says, and we know that they were probably trying to catch him slip up in some way. So this is kind of the setting for what we're going to look at today. And while they're there, it tells us that there's someone observed who has what the Bible called was dropsy. He has a physical ailment or condition of some kind. And so Jesus kind of looks around at these Pharisees and experts in the law, and he asks them a question. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And they were silent. No one responded. So Jesus healed the guy and sent him on his way, right? So, and they said nothing. And then he followed that up by saying, hey, if your son or your ox fell in a well on the Sabbath, would you immediately get him out? Which, of course, we know that any good dad or owner of livestock would, right? But they say nothing, right? Because they don't want to be caught in this conundrum either, right? So he looks around, and the next thing he kind of observes at this dinner he's at, he looks at how they're seated. They've chosen to be seated. And apparently, and Dr. Ramey, you probably know a lot more about this, but it seems to me at that time that important people probably got a more important seat at someone's home. If you were invited to a banquet or something important, it looks to me like important people probably got more preferred seating, probably at the head of the table, more important, all the way out to least important, I'm guessing. So Jesus is commenting on this, and he looks out, and then he says, if you get invited to a wedding feast or a banquet, don't sit at the most prominent seating. He says, because interestingly, somebody who's more important than you might have gotten invited, and it's going to be embarrassing if the host comes and says, you need to move down. And he said, instead, you should sit at the most humble place. And then maybe the host will come down and say, hey, wow, I have a seat better for you. Come on up and join me. So this is the conversation he's having as he's been invited to this dinner. I would love to have Jesus come to my house and analyze my hosting abilities. I think that would be something crazy. But it's funny because after he says that, then he says, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your family, your brothers, your sisters, your best friends. Don't invite important people. He told them, because those people are going to invite you back. They might repay you. Those are people you would expect to socialize with. And he said, instead, if you give a banquet, invite the poor or the lame. Invite those people who aren't going to get an invite from somebody else. And so kind of what a cool dinner guest, first of all, if Jesus is invited, if you invite him to your dinner. But it's funny because after he says all this stuff, finally one of them speaks up. And this is what he said. He heard Jesus say all these things, and then he said, one of them speaks up and he said, "Blessed is the man who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." This guy basically is commenting finally after Jesus said all that.
It's hard for us to understand the context in many ways. If you go to the royalty of Europe now and the last 500 years, there was a seating arrangement for every meal.
Okay.
I've been to special banquets in which you tried to, the head table, it becomes a contest of where someone is to sit.
Right.
Closer to the center is the prominent one, and at the edges is someone else. And sometimes I've been near the center, sometimes I've been out at the end.
Sure.
But in most of our families today, we rush in to mealtime and takes whatever's available.
Yeah.
We're not so conscious, and so it's hard for us to understand some of the dynamics here that Jesus is talking about, because we live life so differently.
Yeah, for sure.
In some families, even today, the mother or a few serve the tables, and sometimes they don't get to sit down.
Yeah.
But most of us are not concerned about position.
Right.
Around the table.
You made me think of the Christmas movie, right? The kid with the Red Ryder BB gun, remember? And one point he said, "My mother had never sat down to a hot meal in years," or something.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
I can relate to that. I'd say the closest we come to anything like this is probably, at a wedding. You'll have a head table and you'll have the bridesmaids and grooms. And sometimes there will be a guest list, or if you attend a fancy dinner party. But I think you're right. We don't think in those hierarchical terms, on a regular basis.
Right. In the days of Jesus, there were no tables.
Okay.
A few years ago, working in the summertime in that part of the world, our work crew was invited over to the house of one of the fellow workers. Mm-hmm. And there were about 12 of us that went over for the special meal. And it was a very special meal for the family to entertain these guests.
Okay.
We weren't concerned about first, second, third positions, but when we went in the room, we looked around. There was no table, there were no chairs.
Okay.
And we were invited to sit on the floor.
Nice.
As is the custom of most of the servant class in that part of the world still today. Now, if you go into the city in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, they're very European, but no tables, no chairs.
Okay.
And so the host and hostess, she would prepare the food, and the host and hostess brought in the food and set it, a big tray about 3 foot in diameter, in the center, and we formed 2 small groups around it, and then we were shown how to eat.
Okay.
We had no knives, forks, or spoons, and so we were. First of all, they sent around a wash bowl to wash our hands so that we were clean, and one for the one group and a wash bowl for the second group. And after our hands were clean, we were told to reach at the bottom level on this serving tray, which was mostly biscuits and doughy material. Take a small amount rub it together, and then go to the middle section, which is rice, and mix some rice with it, and then go to the top section and mix some meat. So your fingers mix
Okay.
the food. And then you have a small, like a spaghetti meatballs, you'd have a small amount, and then you would flip it in your mouth. Your fingers touch the food and never touch anything else. Don't
Right.
touch your mouth and keep clean. And so we ate our meal that way.
Okay.
And then when the meal was over, there was a second bowl of water passed around the circle, and you washed your hands so there was nothing sticky,
Right.
and your hands were clean again.
You know,
It was a very clean meal, but it was
Yeah.
something I never tasted that way before. No knives, no forks, no spoons, no chairs, no tables.
right. You know, it's interesting what you're describing is, you know, a pretty intimate setting. It's a little more cozy and, you know, not as formal as we would imagine, you know, a formal feast or something. But it's interesting because I think in that case, you'd want to have proximity to the people you think are important,
Right.
or the people you want to be near. And so that kind of helps sum up all, you know, Jesus is saying it's not, don't invite just people you're comfortable with or people you would feel comfortable with them. You know, don't invite people who will pay you back or make you feel important. He's saying invite the people that aren't going to get an invitation, because he's going to demonstrate to us that, you know, those might be the actual important guests. So, yeah. So,
Yeah, and the other feature that I always think about in reading these stories,
Mhm.
the parables of Jesus, when Jesus was seated at the meal, whether he was seated on the floor or wherever, and the others around, the people who were not invited to the meal are at the windows.
oh yeah,
They're at the windows watching,
right.
and the meal is a public affair,
Yeah.
and the people in the windows are trying to see, well, who is in first place, who's in second place, and who's at the bottom of the list.
Right.
And so you have people who are receiving the food, who are enjoying the food, and who are interacting with one another. Then you have a second group outside looking in.
Right. Yeah.
And
George, what you were describing
No.
kind of sounds like, you know, even, you know, back then and nowadays, that they take meals a little more importantly than we do, and they see it more of a social interaction time. You know, where, you know, they'll sit down and they view this time as, you know, more of an event,
Right.
and you know, more social gathering than we do now. We just think it's a meal, and, you know, part of the family's in one room eating, part of the family maybe in another room eating. So, you know, even, you know, different parts of the world today kind of see
I
those
remember
meals.
when all the children have to sit in the other room and not eat anything until all the adults are finished.
Wow. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but do the children in your family sit in the other room and wait until all the adults are finished?
No. Nope.
Not anymore.
Nope.
No. And so it's hard for us to even understand the story because our customs have changed so much.
Right. Yep.
Yep. Good point.
Yeah. And as we go forward into the actual parable that we're going to look at for a minute today, just as a reminder, I guess, to everybody who's with us this morning, you know, parables are really powerful teaching tools. A parable is just a story that has a lesson, you know, that's part of it. And Jesus used them all of the time. And it's kind of a familiar setting. Jesus is hanging out with some people, invited to a meal. And of course, it's story time with Jesus. He's going to use this opportunity to tell, you know, to use a parable to help them hopefully stretch their minds a little bit. And it's interesting to me how, you know, I try to imagine being at that moment at the time. What were these people like sitting here listening to Jesus tell this parable that we're going to look at? But, you know, he's speaking to us today too. And it's always so fascinating to me that people who have long been gone, they've been dust of the earth for, you know, millennial times, a couple thousand years. And yet I can read this story and we can share it today and still learn from it.
When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent a servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I have just bought a field, and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.'
So the slave returned and reported these matters to his master. The owner of the house became angry and said to his servant, 'Go out at once into the streets and the alleyways of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' And the servant said, 'Sir, what you ordered has been done, and there is still room.' Then the master said to the slave, 'Go out into the streets and the alleyways and compel people to come in so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited will taste my dinner.'"
We just got done talking about Jesus being at this big feast. Now he kind of flips the coin and says somebody else had created a big dinner party, invited all these people. I had to laugh because just a second ago we said that back then, we're still learning from stories that are very, very old. And I listened to those excuses that these people gave, and I thought those are not any different from the same excuses we might use, right? Or that other people use. And they seem kind of flippant. If it says a certain man was preparing a great banquet. So I get the idea this was a big deal. It wasn't just a, hey, come on over and watch the football game with me. It was a big deal. And he invited many guests. And then it was time to have it. And no one shows. And the servant goes out and looks for them. And the people kind of say, well, I just got some new stuff. I gotta, I'm dealing with that. Or, I gotta go get something. Or I guess I just got married. That one, maybe let's give that guy a break. But
And it was a big deal back then to accept an invitation like that
yeah,
and to not show or to turn it down. That was a big deal back then.
right.
We don't think of it as that big a thing nowadays, which is rude. It is rude to do that.
He didn't just text them.
Right.
I'm sure there was days of preparation. The form of communication was all personal, right? I'm sure they had an invitation. And so I'm kind of empathizing with the host. That's sad. My feelings are hurt for him. I feel bad. He must have been very disappointed.
And went to a lot of trouble. I mean, that's a lot of time and effort and money.
And I think when you have, an event, you personally select the people. He had invested in those particular people and invited them, and said he invited many people. Whenever I create a guest list, there's a lot of thought put into that. Who would I love to have with me? Who might like to be with who else? There's a lot of thought that goes into that. And so it sounds like he'd invited a lot of people. But what's interesting is all those people that he had, I guess, seen some importance in, didn't value the invitation. It sounds like they weren't as committed to the relationship maybe as he was, right?
Yeah.
So what happens next is what I find the most interesting. So he says, he didn't say, okay, cancel the party. So the message I'm getting here is that no matter what, this party is going to go on. This event is going to take place, right? This special opportunity still exists. It's just that somebody else is going to get to benefit from it. And so he sends the servant out and he says, well, go find whoever you can find. And he doesn't say, it's kind of interesting. He says, go in the streets and the alleys. And he specifically says, the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.
I think he specifically pointed out people that don't normally get invited to these things,
Yeah.
and because they don't experience these, and
Yeah.
especially that group of people. I mean, they're probably staying home and doing as little as possible. So,
Yeah.
let's give these people a little bit of pleasure. Let's let them experience something that they've never experienced before.
Right. Because I'm sure this was a fancy banquet, and I'm sure there was very valuable food, and I'm sure it was set up, in a fancy way. If we look at this from this message, remember, a parable is a teaching story. It kind of seems to me that the takeaway here is that, I think it's metaphorical, right? Which is what a parable often is. It's saying that Jesus has prepared this huge banquet for us. We've all been invited, and that it's ready, and that sometimes we are making excuses, often flippant ones, to not attend, right? But the message too is that the banquet is going to happen no matter what. The banquet is taking place. It's here, and we are invited, and we can choose to attend or not. But one thing I think that's also interesting is kind of the message to us that Jesus is really interested in serving those who maybe somebody else might not serve, right? And that's kind of a helpful message for us, because at the end he says, the servant says, okay, I did what you said. I went and got those people. And he said, but we still have lots of room. That was encouraging to me too, because again, this is kind of how Jesus treats us. He's invited us and he's brought together all these people, but the table isn't full yet. There's still room at the table. And so he tells the servant, he said, well, get back out there and go out and find more. Go find more people, But he does close it by saying, not one of those men who didn't show up the first time are going to get a taste of my banquet. And that's kind of maybe a harsher ending to this sweet resolution to the story. I think sometimes we don't like to hear that message, that Jesus's table is very inclusive. It really is for everyone, and not always for the people you think it's for. If hosting a banquet meant, or a dinner party, or a get together, or a church service, right, or an opportunity, if that meant literally going out in the streets, if the three of us were directed, let's go find all the lame, blind, poor, helpless people we can find, then our church service or our dinner party or our Super Bowl party or whatever it is would look a lot different. That one made me think. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Well, the banquet that God has doesn't depend on a person's status in society or their rank in society. It's what you have in your heart, and those people step back. They don't pursue those worldly things. So it's not based on your status.
Yeah. Kind of like he said at the beginning, sit at the end of the table.
Yeah, right.
Because there's probably somebody, and I think also the lesson kind of pointed out that the guest of honor sometimes would surprise us. Mm-hmm. It's not that person with status, like you said,
mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because he's telling this story, this conversation is taking place, this parable is being instructed to what are probably some of the most esteemed members of this particular community, right? The Pharisees and those people educated in the law, people who knew, I guess when they walked around, people looked at them and saw something important. And like George said a little while ago, if they were peeking in the window for the banquet, they would expect to see those guys in the most prominent seats. And yet Jesus is saying, not so gently, that you're not as important as you think you are, and that your seat isn't here. The people I'm really looking for, that I would sit at the head of my table, would be these. Can you imagine, do you have any thoughts about how that was received? If you were a Pharisee at the time, or someone of status. How do you think this went over?
About the same as it would today. People would be many people would be offended.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
They were offended, and that's why they criticized Jesus.
Right. Yep. And it's interesting to me because I like to think of myself in the pool of people who would not be offended. But let's be honest, we all have these thoughts sometimes, I think intentionally or not. We've all placed ourselves in some ranking system
Right.
in humanity. And I just the other day I was with some students and we put it was a world wealth calculator. Maybe you've seen such a thing. You could type in your income and it would show you where you are in comparison to the rest of the world. And my private college music professor income placed me in the 96th percentile. So literally 95% of the world lives off less than my family does.
Yes.
And that was amazing to me when you think about that, So there's 95% of the world I should be inviting to my table. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Right.
Wow.
So I guess putting it in that kind of context helps us see it. Well, Jesus is looking at this a little differently, and he's reminding us that that he is an inclusive figure. When he thinks about the people he wants to come to his party or his dinner, he's thinking of literally everyone. And he's probably, flipping the importance.
Reasoning that we make is oftentimes based on income.
Yeah.
I have more income, therefore I should be higher on the list.
Yep.
Sometimes it's the color of skin.
Sure.
Because if someone wealthy from another country comes in, and we find problems because we've had students at Cumberland who have come in as royalty from their country.
Yeah. Right.
They're a prince, and it was very irritating because I'm thinking of one 40 years ago. He came in as as a special student, sent here by some of our Baptist missionaries, and he wanted to be treated royally. And after at the end of that first semester, he left Cumberland because he was not treated royally. He went to another school, Baptist school in another state, and when he came back to visit, he was driving a new Cadillac because the rich oil men that he met in the other state accepted his royal status and made him feel special.
Yep.
But he was a good but average student.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're right. We look at all kinds of classifications to deem who we think are important and invite to our table.
Right.
And you're right, wealth can be part of it, but social status, or I guess importance in the community, all those things play a part. But I think it'd be interesting, what kind of a game on challenge for all of us this week as we go through the week would be to just think about, if your table or your event is literally kind of your everyday approach to things, who are you inviting into your conversation? Who are you inviting into, your circle of influence? Who are we inviting or spending time on preparing? A banquet takes a lot of preparation. You're kind of like Rick said a while ago, you're preparing like your best, it's a big deal. Right. It's a feast. So those things that I have in my life that are my best, or things that I spend a lot of time preparing to share, who is the recipient of that, and who am I gearing it toward? So as we just wrap up today, do you guys have any more thoughts about how can we help or encourage others to just maybe grow our perspective? I don't think that this is an overnight thing that all of a sudden tomorrow everybody's going to create a big event and invite all the people they've never invited before, even though that would be kind of cool. How can we, I just think as normal everyday people in our jobs, our families, church, what is something we can do to really start just broadening our horizon and thinking more about our brothers and sisters literally being everyone, not just the people we're comfortable with or the people who would invite us back? Got any suggestions for our listeners about that? That's tough.
Yeah, I think if you just apply it, not necessarily to, a banquet or whatever, but just be more accepting of others, understand a person's situation, that, they may be acting a certain way and it may be contradictory to what you feel is right, or it may offend you or whatever, but just realize that they may be going through something that you don't understand. And, there's a reason for their actions, and just to be a little more sympathetic and empathize a little more with them and a little more understanding.
Yeah. And realize that Jesus would invite them before he'd invite you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. At this point, I'm always reminded of things that have happened in my life. Years ago, when Jimmy Carter, the former president, came to speak at our campus, special arrangements were made, and he had been involved in some international episodes and therefore he had special security guards and all, and faculty and the staff are all told, you won't get to speak to Jimmy Carter because his security will keep him separate from everybody else. And it was interesting. We had the formal meal and things went as expected. But then when it was almost over, Jimmy Carter got up, walked out onto the main floor, and shook hands with everyone in the room, including the students who were waiting tables.
Nice.
And he treated everybody the same.
Yeah.
Now, we did not treat him that way, but that's the way he treated us.
Interesting. Yeah.
Amazing.
That's a great illustration.
Perfect example. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good example, George. Thank you.
Yep. So I'll close with this last little statement. The lesson got summed up in our study by saying, just to remember that when we're invited to, when Jesus extends this invitation, to try and really weigh our answer to that and try to avoid the sorry, I'm busy response. That invitation is out there and we can come up with lots of excuses not to attend. But it's very, very important that if we've been led to believe that what we're doing is so busy, then we're kind of ranking our importance as being probably a little too high. I think that we need to think about how we respond to this invitation. And then to remember too, that the guests of honor at this banquet we're all invited to, the guests of honor probably would surprise us. It's not always who we would expect. It's not all the evangelical leaders of the world probably that will be first at the table. I don't know, but I mean, it's important to remember that. And then here's what I really like. If you really are thinking on this bigger scope, these terms, that you're going to need a bigger table, right? That's a way to sum up the lesson today. We just need to think in terms of the biggest table possible. We're always going to need a bigger table. Yeah. Yep. Anything else? No? Well, I thank you guys for being here, and I hope that everybody who is able to watch it is blessed in some way. I know that every time we get to do this, it's a blessing to me, for sure. Yeah, so, and I'll throw out this little invitation to anybody who's listening today. If you ever want to be part of a Bible study, please just contact any of us here or Andy and just let them know, because we'd love to include others if they'd like to be involved. Yeah, cool. All right, thanks guys. Have a great day. Everybody have a good week.
All right, you too.
Thank you.
Thanks.